Welcome to this conversation about climate change. So what we have here is 4 people who are either currently at Newnham or have a Newnham connection. And I will let them all introduce themselves rather than putting words into their mouths. But what we're going to do is to address different aspects of climate change. This is a topic which is of overriding importance to everybody now. And we need to take it seriously. And there are so many different dimensions of it that we wanted to explore some different ways in which we can think about it, different mitigation measures, different ways in which perhaps we can tackle the problem. So what we're going to do is each of us will give a 5-8 minute presentation on our different perspectives on the topic of climate change very broadly. Penny will start off by talking about what's going on, and then we'll talk about the impact on different aspects of the natural world and the built environment, and then talk a bit about what we can do to mitigate the effects or to respond to them. And so to start with, I'd like to ask Penny to tell us about what's going on, please, Penny.
Thank you very much, Claire. And yes, I'm Penny Endersby. I'm the Chief Executive of the Met Office and a proud Newnham alumna and honorary associate. And I thought it would be useful speaking to this audience just to give you a little bit of an overview of our latest understanding of the facts of what's going on with the climate at the moment. And I should acknowledge in doing this that these slides are built on the work of climate scientists in the Met Office Hadley Centre, which is one of the world's leading climate research institutes. And particularly, some of them are from Professor Stephen Belcher, our chief scientist, and some of them have been prepared to brief very senior delegates from the UK to COP26 so that they go into the negotiations with the most up-to-date scientific understanding that they can have. So where are we at the moment? And when you look at this slide, I want to stress there is no modelling in here. Everything on this slide is a direct observation. And the chart on the bottom left is looking at where we are with temperature. And it shows a temperature series for global temperature going back to about the foundation of the Met Office in the mid-19th century. And we have, in fact, some of the longest temperature records anywhere on the planet, going back about a century further than that for the UK. But these are global temperatures. And you can see at once the moment when the post-industrial period started to kick in and the temperatures really started to rise rapidly compared with the pre-industrial period up to about 1900. And the other charts are charts of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the bottom one, again, is directly measured from the atmosphere, and it already starts above the baseline in about 1960. And it shows the carbon dioxide rising over time to where we are today in around about the 400 parts per million. But the chart above is a much, much longer time series. And these are still observations, but they're observations from ice cores. And they go back for the last million years or so, long before there were humans on the planet. And you can see humans emerging around about an ice age or 2 ago. And what you can see is there is a natural cycle of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but it's growing much, much faster now under the influence of human activity than it ever has in the past, and to an unprecedented level. So we've never tried supporting human beings on this planet with this level of carbon dioxide before, still less 10 billion of them. And if I move from the observations to the modelling and actually look at what is causing this, there is really no doubt at all. And on these charts, the black lines are still observations. And in the Met Office, we now take in about 2 billion observations of one kind or another a day, of all kinds of temperature and weather and cloud and atmospheric conditions. And the red and the blue lines are models of how the climate behaves. And on the left is a chart where we only take into account what's going on with naturally emerging greenhouse gases, and not just carbon dioxide, but all the other greenhouse gases as well. And on the right is what happens when we include the human emissions into that. And as you can see, that takes us from being out of step with what we actually observe going on with global temperatures to going perfectly in step. So this is really well understood science now. The error bars are much, much, much smaller than the trend. And what we can see is that, and this is a statement from 2018 that says human activities are estimated to have caused about 1 degree of global warming already. I think that's now 1.1. And we know that if we keep going as we are, we're going to hit 1.5 degrees on average somewhere in the next 10 to 30 years. And we're really very confident that this is the case. So what does this mean for us? Well, in the UK, we know that global warming is going to cause us to experience warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers with more intense periods of drought. But when we do get rain, summer or winter, it's likely to be more intense. So we're likely to get more severe flooding, and we'll experience fewer sort of snow and ice days. And we are already in a changed climate, and we're already seeing the impacts of this. So if you look at the floods that took place in the south of England in the winter of 2013-14, they became more severe and more likely and caused more damage because of the changed climate we were in. If you look at the summer heat wave of 2018 in actually the whole of Northern Europe, not just the UK, our modelling shows this was about 30 more times likely to happen than it would have been, and caused about double the excess deaths that heat wave could have caused. And it's worth saying at this point that climate change is a risk multiplier. The question to ask is not, was an event caused by climate change, but how much more likely and how much more severe was it as a result? And if we look on a global level, and the example I've picked here is the Siberian heat wave in 2020, we're getting off the scale of it there being any other cause. Actually, the temperature deviation was so extreme that it was more like 600 times more likely, almost impossible for it to have happened without human forcings on the climate. And obviously, we're experiencing a similar heat wave at the moment in Canada and the northern US. And we think that would have been a 1 in 10,000 year event in an unperturbed climate. At the moment in the climate we're in, we think it's going to happen about 2 years in 30. And by the end of the century, if we don't get a grip on things, that's going to be a fairly average summer for the northern US and the northern hemisphere. So these events are happening really very worryingly fast and very severely. And the Arctic and the northern latitudes are experiencing greater warming than other parts of the planet. So what's the implications of limiting our warming? And what you can see on this next chart is the kinds of impacts that are going to happen globally, the numbers of people exposed to drought, severe heat waves, the effect on crops, the effect on flooding. And you can see that there's a big step, particularly above 2 degrees. And that's why it's so important that we do everything we can to hold warming to 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees above industrial levels. And that chart on the right shows you that we're getting perilously close to that already. And in fact, at our current rates of usage, we've only got about 10 years more carbon burning to do before we hit that 1.5 degree threshold. And we expect to see months globally above 1.5 degrees well before that. So we're already in a changed climate. In fact, we haven't seen the worst that our current 1 degree climate can throw at us yet, because we haven't had even 30 years in it, never mind thousands, to see those 1 in 100 year events. We must mitigate, we must reduce the carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as we can to net zero. But even if we do that, that's not going to reverse the warming, that's just going to slow it down and eventually stop it. The climate will stabilise. So we also need to be prepared to adapt. And when I hand back to Claire, that's what we're going to hear about now from some of our next speakers. Before I do that, just a quick summary of what I've said. The climate is changing. We know what's causing that. That's greenhouse gas emissions on the part of human beings. We must get to the global net zero. We're already feeling the impacts of climate change, and we need to remember to mitigate and to adapt.
Good. That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Penny, for starting us off in such a depressing way. Adam is going to take on the challenge of the natural environment.
All right, well, thanks a lot. So my name's Adam Pellegrini. I'm a university lecturer in the Department of Plant Sciences at Cambridge and a senior member at Newnham. And my research primarily focuses on ecosystems and ecology. So studying anything from biodiversity patterns to the cycling of energy and nutrients through a system to thinking about how disturbances affect systems. So today I'm going to be talking about a topic that I find incredibly interesting, and that's how changing environmental hazards interact with climate change. And the reason why I have my title saying in there, Dance with Climate Change, is because it's not just climate change that is imparting changes in things like floods, in droughts, in fires, in insect outbreaks, but also how these factors impact ecosystems have the potential to feed back onto climate change. So the reason why this is the case is because when humans emit carbon to the atmosphere, actually about half of that is taken back up by both the land as well as the ocean. And this uptake in many cases is resulting in a large change to the biosphere. And that's because the things that are responsible for that uptake are living things like plankton as well as plants. And as a consequence of things like photosynthesis, only about half of anthropogenic carbon emissions remain in the atmosphere. So you can imagine how much faster climate change would be happening if, for example, there were no plants. I've put up this figure here. It's a little complicated, but I'll walk you through it. And on the y-axis, what it is showing you is the flux of carbon dioxide. And this big orange line is showing you the amount of emissions from the fossil fuel industry. Then there's the yellow band, that's emissions from land use change. So that's the things that you hear about with deforestation and oil palm planting. Some of that carbon, like I said before, is taken up by both the ocean, so that's the ocean sink, as well as the land sink. And so those are things like plants. And then of course, some of it remains in the atmosphere, right? That's what we just heard about from Penny, where we're seeing a rise in the concentration of carbon dioxide. So this clearly shows that the biological activity of things like plants on land are important for determining the rate of climate change. So a lot of my work is on understanding, okay, what are some of the factors that determine those rates of things like plant growth? And one of the biggest factors that we're seeing today is how shifting disturbance patterns are changing the capacity of ecosystems to store carbon. So anthropogenic deforestation has always been a big factor, right? The deforestation of the Amazon, you have land clearing in Southeast Asia, as well as timber harvesting. But what's most concerning are the rise of natural disturbances. So things like droughts and wildfires. And so I'm just focusing on two particular examples here on wildfires. And the reason for that is because when a fire burns through a landscape, it combusts plant biomass and releases that carbon to the atmosphere in forms of carbon dioxide, methane. And as a result of that, it further increases the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. So how do we know that disturbance patterns have been changing as a result of climate change? Well, there's two really great examples that I'll talk about. The first is a figure on the left, and this is taken from the Rocky Mountains in the Western US. And the reason why this figure is so striking is because what they did was they looked at the concentration of charcoal in lake sediment, and they were able to determine the frequency of fires from this charcoal over the past 2,000 years. And that's basically the smoothed red line that you're looking at the bottom there. And then when they look at the last 2 decades, you can see that there is this massive uptick, especially over the last decade. And so oftentimes when we look at, okay, how is climate change shifting things like disturbances, you see these types of graphs where there's just this unprecedented uptick in a disturbance frequency. Now, another way to look at it is to use model-based simulations. And with fire, what people generally focus on is how anthropogenic climate change is shifting how dry conditions are, and as a consequence, how likely they are to burn. As Penny mentioned earlier, with those hot Siberian summers, that resulted in really, really hot and extensive wildfires. So this figure is from the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California. So a lot of fires have really become a danger to people. And what these models show is the amount of burned area in 3 different scenarios. The first is from the observed increases in how dry the fuel was. So that's the red line. The second is just without any sort of anthropogenic climate change. So that's the black line. And so the difference between those 2 lines tells you the contribution of climate change to increased fire. Now, why does this matter? Well, this is resulting in a fundamental transformation to ecosystems. So oftentimes when a system is disturbed, it's able to recover, right? New plants colonize, they're specialized to that, they do a great job regrowing, and sure enough, the ecosystem returns to its starting state. But with more severe disturbances and more frequent disturbances, they're inhibiting the ability of the system to get back to that state. And as a consequence, inhibiting its ability to store carbon, as well as a number of other things like harbor biodiversity. And so this is a massively changing field of scientific research. So what can we do? Well, because of the importance of ecosystems in determining the global carbon cycle, there's been a lot of energy that's been put into understanding how we can manage ecosystems to sequester carbon in sustainable ways. And so that's taken on several different names, most notably natural climate solutions or nature-based climate solutions. These are things that you often hear about in the news. And ultimately what they're talking about is, okay, how can we preserve the function of an ecosystem? Let's say its ability to harbor biodiversity or provide food, and then maximize carbon storage. So there's 3 general options. The first one is just thinking about carbon stored in things like plant biomass. Well, when you look at grasses, that's very short term. So in wet years, you see a large sequestering of carbon from the atmosphere because grasses are growing. This is across the globe, but then that tends to be lost in the next year. Now, another very popular one is planting trees and encouraging woody encroachment, but this can result in massive declines in biodiversity. Sometimes it doesn't even lead to greater gains in carbon because of changes in soils. And then you also have a system that's very vulnerable to disturbance. A lot of times these trees that are planted are also very susceptible to things like drought and fire. Now, one of the more promising ones, and what I am focusing on now, is soil carbon sequestration. And so this is a potentially very large pool, but it's unconstrained because we can't measure it from space like we can when we fly over and count the number of trees on land. And our models still aren't very good at it. So it's a exciting new frontier in fighting climate change, and potentially large, but also very uncertain. Thank you, and I will turn it back to you, Claire.
Adam, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. So now I'll hand over to Alice to talk about more of the built environment, so the human parts of that.
Thanks very much, Claire. So hello, I'm Alice Moncaster. I'm a senior lecturer at the Open University now. I'm an alumna of Newnham and I was a fellow of Newnham. And Claire asked me to talk about the built environment, which is my area of research, and how climate change is impacted by the built environment, and also the impact of climate change on the built environment. So why the built environment? This is the sector that is responsible, if you see it as a single sector, for the highest amount of carbon emissions of any sector. It's responsible for 39% of the anthropogenic carbon emissions. And this is from 2 different aspects. The first is the operational carbon from heating, cooling and lighting buildings, which is 28% of all carbon emissions. And the second is from the embodied carbon, which is from the construction materials and the transport of those materials and the construction processes, which adds an additional 11% of global carbon emissions. So this is a major impact. And I hope from what Penny has already said about the impact that our anthropogenic emissions are having on the climate, and indeed from what Adam has said about what that impact is having on our land, we can see that these need to be reduced really radically. So a bit more detail about those two different aspects. The operational impacts are currently regulated across most countries. So across Europe, this started in 2002 or before really, with the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which has fed into building regulations. And across other countries too, there are building regulations which limit the amount of energy that our buildings use, so increase the energy efficiency of our buildings. And zero carbon new buildings, zero operational carbon buildings are now possible through passive house design and other similar schemes where you have super insulated, very airtight buildings with mechanical heat recovery. Renewable electricity has really supported this, either renewable grid electricity or on-site renewables in individual buildings. So for instance, in the UK, our grid electricity has halved in carbon intensity over just the last 10 years, and it's gone down from 0.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour to 0.25 or lower now. However, embodied impacts, those are the impacts from the materials and the construction activities, are not regulated in almost any countries. I think just Netherlands and France have currently got regulations in place about embodied impacts. They are higher in rapidly developing countries such as China, a bit lower in more developed countries with older built environments such as Europe. So it's around 9% in the UK and about 16% of national emissions in China. Two particular materials which have a very bad press for this are cement and steel. That's partly because they are carbon intensive and partly because they are just in such vast use across the world. And so there's a very strong move towards, certainly from a certain sector of the construction industry, towards using materials such as cross-laminated timber, which is the building at the bottom you can see being built to cross-laminated timber panels, which is like a sort of giant plywood. The transport of materials is also part of their embodied impacts, and this is often ignored. So importing steel from China, for instance, or even bricks from Bangladesh to the UK, which some of our bricks come from Bangladesh, adds a huge impact of carbon emissions. So a Bangladeshi brick is 2.5 times the carbon impact of a UK brick when used in the UK. So these two aspects, the operational and the embodied, do they mean together that we should demolish all of our old energy inefficient buildings and redevelop them? Or does it mean that we should retrofit our aging buildings, particularly in Europe? So I've chosen to show a street picture from Catania in Sicily, and clearly this is an ancient street. And I think most of us agree that heritage buildings and historic built environment really adds to our social experience of our environment and have real historic value, and that we really want to keep them. But what about if I'd shown you a picture of, say, a 1980s housing estate? You might be thinking, well, obviously we should demolish that and rebuild it. In fact, if you carry out the life cycle assessment, the answer is no, you shouldn't. You should almost always retain buildings. The embodied carbon embodied within those buildings is so huge that you don't want to demolish it and rebuild it. It costs in carbon terms at least twice as much to demolish and rebuild buildings as to retain them and refurbish them to current energy efficiency standards. However, this is a trade-off, and it is still worth doing those calculations, certainly on a national scale. So the second thing I was going to talk about, but very briefly, is what about the impact of climate change on the built environment? So Penny and Adam have both talked so far about the increasing heat, and we know ourselves that we've had heat waves in the last few years, which have been quite hard to live with in our own built environment. There's also an increased risk of flooding, and more buildings across the UK and across the world are at increased risk of flooding. So we need to be retrofitting our buildings for these future climates. So I think Penny mentioned 2050 as being a date by which we expect to be at least 1.5 degrees, if not 2 degrees warmer. What the built environment will exist of in 2050 has mostly already been built. So these buildings need to be retrofitted for those future climates. And what can we do about that? We can plant trees for shading and reducing urban heat island effect. We can add external shutters to houses that are allowed to have external shutters. And we can put in flood resilience measures. So how do we achieve this whole thing of both mitigating, reducing our built environment impact on the climate and adapting to the inevitable future climates? So first of all, we must minimise new build. Any new building is going to have a very high embodied carbon impact, and that impact is going to happen pretty much before the end of construction. So it's going to be very immediate, a huge burst of carbon impact. So we must minimise our new build. Where we do have new buildings, we should ensure that they're zero operational carbon, and that's perfectly doable, and there's no excuse for not doing it. We should use, therefore, minimal, local and low carbon and recycled materials where possible. So I haven't talked much about construction waste, but the construction industry has a huge waste impact as well. And I've shown a picture at the top is a house in Copenhagen, which is built out of shipping containers. So that's an upcycled house, not even recycled, upcycling shipping containers. We really need to retrofit all our existing buildings. So this is an existing building, both to reduce our operational energy and carbon and to improve our resistance to future heat and flooding. And finally, I want to make the point that although I've only talked about buildings as part of the built environment and buildings themselves are part of a much bigger system, a socio-technical system, which includes us as the inhabitants. And we are responsible for using this energy, and we need to reduce our own carbon and energy practices. So that's all I have to say. Claire, I'm going to pass over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. And leading on from that, so I'm Claire Barlow, I'm a current fellow at Newnham, I'm in the engineering department, and my expertise is on rubbish, so end-of-life materials, and particularly I've been working on plastics. And so what I want to talk about now is some of the human aspects interrelating with the technical aspects of one of the things that we're particularly sensitive to at the moment with plastics, which is food packaging. So we're going from these huge global problems to something which is very much on our doorstep in our kitchen. But I'm going to try to make some linkages between all of those aspects. So plastics have particularly hit the headlines with marine waste, the blue planet effect. What David Attenborough has done for us is to raise our consciousness about the effect that plastics in the natural environment have. So I'm focusing on plastic packaging because here it is being 38% of our usage of plastics. The next biggest usage is in buildings, 22%, but buildings tend to stay there for a long time. And if we listen to Alice, they're going to stay there for an awful lot longer. And so although those plastics are an integral part of buildings and a very important part for making them as efficient as they can be, we needn't worry quite so much about them. The problem with food packaging is that it's very transient. And so the active life, the time when the food packaging is actually doing its job, may be only a matter of a few days and up to weeks, months at the most. So food packaging is going round and round the life cycle very fast, and a lot of it is ending up in the natural environment. So we worry about food packaging. So what's it for? Do we need it? Well, yes, we certainly do. So we need it to be able to handle liquids and powders. We need it to provide mechanical protection for all the delicate foods that we like to eat. And a really important thing is that we need it to act as a barrier layer between the product and the environment. And that barrier layer can do some really quite sophisticated things. So particularly keeping oxygen out and so keeping the food fresh. But there's a lot of food that's in a protective environment, so a gas or a vacuum, and the packaging does that. It keeps smelly cheese smells in and is generally absolutely crucial for hygiene. It has other implications as well, which are pretty beneficial for the way that we regard food and treat it. So it can reduce the amount of processing of food additives, which may be very good for health purposes. And very importantly, it also increases the acceptable length of the food chain, the supply chain, and so enables global food production. Now, this may be good because it means that we can consume food from over the globe, but do we have to do that? Is it actually the right thing that we should be buying in grapes from the other side of the world so we can eat them in January? So that's a personal choice. And if we're thinking about environmental consequences, we might be wanting to think very hard about what foods we eat at what times of year. So in summary, if we have good packaging, then it does reduce food wastage. And that's really important because if we look at the life cycle carbon impact of food production and the food packaging, we find pictures like this. So what I've got here is we've got a kilogram of cheese and chicken, and we've got the CO2 footprint of the cheese and the chicken. And a tiny little bar here, which is the carbon footprint of the packaging. Cheese actually has rather a big environmental footprint. That's cow cheese, and cows are large animals which emit a lot of global warming gases, methane. They live a long time. Chicken, not such good news for the vegetarians, actually has a much smaller carbon footprint. But the packaging is tiny, and in other stages of the life cycle, really the impacts are very small. The disposal stage is so small that you can't actually see any of the bars there. So what does all this mean? Most of the environmental impact comes from making the food, producing the food, growing it. Packaging is absolutely tiny, but it has a huge impact on the lifetime of the product. And so it has a big impact on reducing food wastage. So a lot of what we do in food packaging, a lot of what the supermarkets are really worrying about now, is trying to get their packaging recyclable. And so looking at the end of life, because it's being driven by the Blue Planet effect, the impact of plastic packaging on particularly the marine environment is what people are thinking about. There are other reasons for recycling other than carbon footprint. So, the whole circular economy arguments, reducing the amount of new packaging that we need to make, reducing the amount of plastic that we need to make, and reducing the waste in the natural environment. But if we're just looking at carbon footprint, then that's not what we should be worrying about. We should be worrying about reducing food wastage. So, alternative packaging scenarios, again, very popular is the idea that we should be using biopolymers. And you get a picture like this, which says that you grow stuff and you make something which they don't call plastic because plastic's a dirty word, but it is in fact plastic, bioplastic. Make stuff out of it and that naturally degrades and makes new plants. And we don't use any of this nasty petrochemical, and we don't have any waste in the environment. Nearly every aspect of this slide is not completely true. Some of it is very untrue. And don't get me going on that because I really will go on all night about it. So there are really big question marks over the use of biopolymers. We'll get there in the end, but we need a lot of breakthroughs in every aspect of this, from the agriculture through to the manufacture, through to the disposal stage. All aspects of that are problematic, and biopolymers are at present a tiny fraction of the amount of polymer that we can make and are using. So they're not the answer yet. One other thing that I want to talk about, we're trying to reduce the amount of stuff that we use and dispose of. So what about reusables? So question here, if we're going to use reusable shopping bags, they're more robust than the throwaway single-use carrier bags, but actually what's the environmental implication? Should we be doing this? So let's think about this. Our baseline is a Sainsbury's single-use carrier bag, but we're actually being very good about this because we're going to reuse it as a bin liner at the end of use. So compare that with a bag for life, heavy-duty plastic bag. If you use that 4 times, then that has the equivalent global warming potential to one of those bags, but you have to use it 4 times. Next grade up, a bit more robust, 11 times. Paper bags, 3 times. And the one which we're all supposed to be using, these cotton bags, 131 times. Unless it's organic cotton, in which case it's 400 times, because organic cotton is much more difficult to produce, and so it's more resource intensive. And we're looking here at the global warming potential. If we use another metric, which is actually really valid to some of the things we've been talking about, which is water usage, then it's 7,000 times for an organic cotton bag. So not using stuff once, reusing it is in theory good, but actually for this scenario, the unpalatable conclusion is that actually, in terms of global warming potential, these single-use carrier bags cause the least environmental damage. So I was just going to summarize and say, be very careful about all the knee-jerk reactions to global warming. Global warming is really important, but some of the things that we're doing are not actually quite sensible. And certainly food packaging, that's a really important thing for reducing global warming. Biodegradable polymers, we'll get there in the end, but not there yet. We certainly need to stop using things that we don't need and just stop single-use anything, not just plastics, if we can possibly help it. We do need to have more recycling, and I haven't talked about that, but that's particularly difficult in the UK. We've just got to do more about it and keep the plastics that we have in circulation. So, thank you for that. And what we are now going to do is to have some discussion. So we've all talked about very different aspects. We met for the first time yesterday and had a bit of brief discussion, and people were so full of questions that I opened the floor. Who would like to start? Alice.
I'm very interested to see what you had to say there, Claire. I was wondering if we end up in the future being better at creating biopolymers, as you've suggested, to replace plastic, perhaps. And if we grow more timber for constructing buildings, as I've suggested, then really my question is, I suppose, for Adam, what happens to our biodiversity if we have vast plains of crops being grown for specific things?
Well, I think that, ultimately that's a massive area of research in and of itself, looking at supply chain and attribution of, a particular product or process to things like deforestation, even something like palm oil, where you would think like, oh yeah, that comes from an oil palm plantation. Well, it could be a variety of plantations throughout a number of different countries. Maybe one year it's from Brazil, another year it's from Indonesia. So I am, it's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but oftentimes the majority of things like biodiversity loss due to deforestation, a large amount that's happening now, at least in South America, is driven by like the cattle industry, for example, soy For feeding cattle, obviously that changes. And then in Southeast Asia, it's a whole range of things as well. So that's a long way of saying it's very complicated to pinpoint, yes, that is exactly what happens to biodiversity. And I believe these types of questions is one of the motivations for this new area of research around things like the circular economy and trying to understand like the life cycle of where a product comes from.
Well, we haven't even touched on biofuels, have we? But that's another huge
Yeah.
bit of land use, which you could tie up the whole planet, replacing your fossil fuels with not fossil fuels, and making your synthetic aviation fuel out of wood chip and so on. But you have to choose between feeding the people, providing the energy for the fuel system, and then the sort of rewilding richer ecosystems that you need to store the carbon. And some of our models now are able to take into account these trades, but it's still a really challenging and complex thing to do. And I was fascinated, Adam, by your challenge of how poorly we model what's going on under the soil surface, which I think is a fair challenge. And I'm going to take back to the Met Office Hadley Centre scientists and inquire more about to educate myself further.
Yeah, maybe filter what I say or make me anonymous. So I actually had a question for you, Penny, when you were talking about briefing for the COP26. So there's obviously a lot happening in climate change, in climate science. Can you walk us through at a really high level how you and your team decide, okay, what goes into this briefing? Does that make sense? Like, what are some of the topics? What type of evidence do we want to include?
So there's things we do on a national level, and then there's things we do on a global level. And I maybe should start with those, because obviously the core information that feeds COP26 is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they produce their big report, some of which I quoted from the last one. And Met Office scientists play a huge part in that. Our models will go into what informs it. We have people leading chapter authors and so on. They've just passed the deadline, I think, for submitting those chapters. So that global consensus is really, really important. Over and above that, particularly because we're hosting this year, or co-hosting, we have lots of people, so politicians and officials, for whom this is not their specialist subject, but nevertheless they want to go in with the best evidence base they can, and they tend to come from different perspectives. So some are particularly interested in adaptation or in helping developing nations not follow our path through being a very high carbon economy before they become a lower carbon one. And so then we would tailor the briefings to that. And the slides I picked were ones that were really aimed at the generalist, what's going on, and how severe it is, but there's a lot of how sure are we, what's going to happen at the tipping points, those sorts of things, which are really important for deciding our negotiating stance and what we most want to influence other nations to do.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just curious about the insight into that whole process.
So, Adam, for you, what should we be doing?
I think that a large amount of advancement in things like climate change mitigation in my field comes from interdisciplinary collaborations. So it's when an ecologist that may understand something like, okay, how do soil carbon cycles really behave, are paired with a modeler that can say, well, we can't include everything. So what's like, we need to think about parsimony and scalability. And then you start interacting with people like in the economics or in the political realm that actually talk about, to Penny's point, okay, is biofuel, can we plant it everywhere to use it to fuel something? Or what are the constraints on things like food production in particular countries, right? When you begin to incentivize for some things, it comes at the cost of other things that have a real impact on human livelihoods. And that's something that, for example, is totally out of the purview of my research. I think that what we can do is just continue the conversation and collaboration among across scientific disciplines in forums like this, you know, as far as what can an individual do right now. I think that some of the main things is think a little bit about your the amount of beef that you eat. There's all these new terms like beef budget. I think you can calculate that online. As well as flying. I mean, there's these big ticket items that can be used, but that again is outside of my area of expertise.
Alice, I was going to ask much the same sort of question of you. I mean, you've made it very clear that we should be retrofitting rather than new build. In the UK, can we do that? Or are the regulations preventing us from doing the sensible thing?
Well, when we were talking yesterday, Penny was mentioning, as we can see, in fact, from her backdrop, that she lives in an ancient house and has problems with being allowed to retrofit in an energy efficient way. And about 20%, I think, of our built environment in the UK was built before 2019. Sorry, before 1919, rather more, so before 2019. So those buildings could all be counted as heritage and historic buildings. And what do we do about them is the big question. Do we want to preserve them exactly as they are and let them use too much energy or not? So that's one specific question, I suppose. And the answer there is various. There's some research we're doing at the moment which shows that people like Penny who live in ancient houses actually use less energy than those who live in modern houses. And as another part of the research shows that the building materials are poorly modelled by our current tools. So their houses themselves are actually more energy efficient than the models show. So if you get an energy performance certificate, it will actually show that you are using less energy than the models suggest that you are. There are obviously heritage friendly ways we can retrofit, and lots of things that people who live in heritage buildings would like to do and that are currently not allowed to do. But the rest of the buildings, if you take my house, which is 1920s, there's an awful lot that you can do. It's a solid walled, it's got external render, you can add external insulation, you can put in double glazing, of course, you can block up all your drafts around your doors and windows, you can add in loft insulation. It's very, very easy to actually do this. And it's also easy to just turn your temperature down. And this can save a huge amount of carbon emissions across the country if we all just turned our thermostats down, wore more jumpers. As I'm not today, but.
But you haven't got your air conditioning on either.
No, nor our heating. There is, yes, no air conditioning. I have to say, so retrofitting for future climates, avoiding air conditioning and particularly avoiding standalone portable air conditioning units such as are in use across Mediterranean very hot cities is really important, because they just chuck out the heat to the outside and make the cities hotter and make the problem worse and use a lot of energy. And it's, yeah.
Yes, putting green material, you know, growing green things up the outside of your walls, which both shades the house and maintains the temperature more stably and cools the environment out and stores the carbon.
Yeah.
Than having a fossil fuel burning portable air conditioner, moving the heat from inside to outside for it to come back in again, which is often the alternative. But there's a whole load of laws where we need to catch up with what's most important, and those planning laws are just one example where we've got really rigorous protections for listed buildings that won't let me change one lot of 1960s single glazing for 2020s double glazing that looks identical. And yet we know that domestic is a huge part of our carbon footprint now in the UK. We've done so well with our grid. One of those big things we have to tackle. So we'll have to look at how we change that. And if you've got homeowners who actually want to spend the money themselves on making their properties carbon efficient, you shouldn't be looking that gift horse in the mouth, I think.
Absolutely. Yes.
I have a nasty feeling that we are running out of time. So I think that we should just do a bit of a wrap up, and I will ask each of the panelists just to spend about a minute giving their take-home message to the audience that I hope we will have. So Penny, would you like to give us your thoughts?
Well, I think people often ask me when I speak at these climate change events, you know, what's the thing I should do? And I think David Attenborough's advice is the best, because all of our lives are different and the adjustments we can make a difference. But he says, don't waste. So whatever it is, and it touched on your food packaging, or on sitting around with your car engine running, or whatever it is, I had not fully appreciated that you can waste a building. But Alice has made me think about just how wasteful it is. So we think when we're on brownfield sites, we're doing a good thing, right? It's rather than rolling it out over the green fields. But it's another of those things, like how many times do you need to reuse your reusable shopping bag, or buying your strawberries in a paper bag and then throwing them away because you didn't eat them the evening you intended to, where we really shouldn't be wasting. And that will change my view, I think, of the way we use our urban environment, and make me focus more on how we can make those properties of all sorts, business and domestic, more reusable more urgently.
Good, thank you. Adam.
Yeah, so I think that a take home is that when we think about climate change and what we can do to try to mitigate climate change, and then what are the factors that are contributing to climate change, we really do need to think about disturbances to ecosystems and just the health of ecosystems overall. And it's really is a two-way street. When we think about climate shifting, the stress on ecosystems, it's not just that, right? The stress on ecosystems and how they respond in turn can feed back to climate change. Now, there's a lot of progress and promise ahead in thinking about managing ecosystems sustainably to try to mitigate climate change. And I think that this is one of the most exciting pathways forward, because it inserts economic sustainability into the issue of climate sustainability.
Brilliant, thank you. Alice.
So I was going to say, going back to the Second World War, I think perhaps what we should all be doing is more make, do and mend, whether it's buildings or plastic bags. And perhaps, Claire, we can just reuse the thin plastic bags, and that would be better still. But also, I was really interested in Adam's talk, and I think there's a lot that we can do in the built environment and the urban environment to work better with ecologists to understand the impact both of our building materials and also of our ideas of shading trees, shading buildings with trees, and adding in green infrastructure to the urban environment to see how we can also support the ecological aspects.
Brilliant. Well, from my perspective, I think just about everything has been said. I could just echo some of the local aspects. So local food production is something which I didn't talk about, but reduces the supply chain length, reduces transport, and must boost the local economy. And the other thing that I would say finally is plastics are not all bad. And if we can particularly dispose of them in a responsible way, then perhaps people will see them as being still the wonder material that they actually are, despite all the bad press that they've had. We've had a very interesting conversation, and I've learned an awful lot. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So thank you all very much indeed for your participation. And I hope that the audience has enjoyed it. And if they want to get in touch with any of us to follow up any of the things that we have raised, then please do it through the 150 committee. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.